Welcome to the patrol that froze without dying. January 1912. Northern Ontario, a land swallowed by ice and silence. 6 men of the Dominion Police set out along the Hudson Bay Line, their mission simple: chart supply routes through the frozen interior. But when the search team arrived weeks later, everything was still there. Sleds, rifles, journals, even meals half prepared, yet the men were gone. No footprints, no struggle. Just a single sentence in the logbook: they're calling again tonight. The snow around the camp was untouched, perfectly smooth, as if the world had pressed pause. Every watch had stopped at 2:37 a.m. One compass spun backward until its needle snapped. The horses' reins were coiled neatly beside the sleds, but the animals themselves had vanished into the open white. In the distance, a thin sound echoed across the ice, half wind, half voice, something that seemed to whisper each man's name. Local Cree hunters refused to pass that stretch again. They said the forest there was hollow, that sound traveled in circles, that hunger had taken shape in the snow. The Dominion report closed the case with 2 words: fate unknown. But those who've stood near the site say you can still feel it, the air bending, time slowing, the sense that someone is standing just beyond the frost, waiting. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Because in stories like this, the hour matters. Some say the Wendigo still calls each winter, always at the same time, always from the frozen line. January 1912. Northern Ontario lay in silence beneath 40 miles of unbroken ice. The Dominion Police had extended their winter patrols north from Fort Albany, mapping smuggling trails that threaded through Cree and Métis territory toward the Hudson Bay frontier. 6 men departed on the 3rd week of January: Constable William Hartley, Corporal Dwyer, and 4 civilian guides known only by initials in the manifest. They were equipped for 28 days, 6 sleds, 8 dogs, 2 phonograph cylinders for field dictation. Their last message, transmitted by heliograph on the 25th, read simply: visibility worsening, continuing north. Nothing more was ever received. 3 weeks later, when the relief party under Sergeant Hale reached their camp, the temperature had dropped to -42. The tents still stood. The dogs were gone. Inside, journals were frozen, stiff open on the final entry. The wind sounds different tonight. The clocks, pocket watches, wristlets, one ship's chronometer, all frozen at the same time. The snow around the encampment lay pristine, unbroken by tracks leading away. The relief men noted no signs of violence, no overturned sleds, no scattered rations. Only silence and an unnatural stillness that one described as so dense it pressed upon the skull. Fort Albany's records show that Hale's men buried the remaining supplies and erected a cross from 2 snowshoes lashed together. They photographed the site and returned to base, their report stamped, "Unresolved, no evidence of hostile action." The government archivist who filed it later annotated the margin in pencil: "Unnatural conditions, consult Department of Indian Affairs." That question was never answered. The story might have ended there, if not for the journals recovered from one of the sled crates a month later. The paper, half frozen and waterlogged, contained 3 legible pages written in Hartley's hand. The first described heavy snow and a strange ringing in the ears like distant bells. The second spoke of dogs refusing to move north beyond a certain ridge. The third, only half a page, read: "Dwyer says he saw lights across the lake. Not stars, not fire. Something walking upright." The ink trailed off mid-word as though his hand had frozen before he finished. The government attempted to retrieve the bodies that spring, but the thaw came early. Floodwaters erased the camp, washing away every trace. Yet that summer, a Cree trapper named Matthias Wapistan reported finding strange circles in the moss wide enough for a man to lie down inside. He said the ground beneath was burned black, though there had been no lightning. His account was filed in the Albany Parish records, then quietly removed the following year. What remains today are fragments, testimonies from rescuers, fragments of equipment, catalogued under Expedition Artifacts 1912. Among them, a compass fused into solid metal by cold, a phonograph cylinder too warped to play, and one piece of wool cloth with a handprint frozen into it. Fingers spread unnaturally long, reaching outward as if pulled from beneath the surface. Forensic analysis decades later found traces of protein too degraded to identify, but inconsistent with human origin. Old men in Moose Factory still tell their version of the story. They say the patrol crossed into the lands of the Atikamekiu spirits, where winter has no end. They say you can still hear them sometimes calling out to each other through the trees, except that the words aren't names anymore, only sounds. A few have claimed to find remnants of the patrol, a brass button here, a torn scrap of map there, but the moment they pick them up, the air grows colder, as though the season itself notices. Archival dispatches from Ottawa in 1913 reveal something stranger still. The expedition wasn't the first to vanish along that route. A Hudson's Bay Company trade convoy in 1888 disappeared under near-identical circumstances. No records were linked at the time. No investigator mentioned the word pattern. But when one compares the coordinates, the lines converge within half a mile. The Cree name for that stretch translates roughly to where the hunger waits. It's easy now to dismiss such reports as coincidence, men lost to exposure compasses failing under magnetic frost. Yet the anomalies remain. A century later, geological surveys found localized drops in temperature along the same corridor pockets of cold air that resist thaw even in midsummer, lingering like ghosts. Wildlife trackers report sudden silences there, birds refusing to cross, wolves avoiding the frozen ponds entirely. Everything official calls it wilderness. But wilderness does not remember names. It does not whisper in the snow. The old patrol line does. Each winter when the wind slides down from James Bay and the ice locks the rivers. Faint echoes drift through the pines, single syllables that sound almost human. Some claim they're tricks of the ear shapes carved by moving air. Others swear they are voices repeating an old roll call that never ended. Hartley, Dwyer, Sutton, McCready, Clark, Price. 6 names caught between record and rumor. Their story lives in fragments of carbon ink and frozen soil in the space between official silence and whispered superstition. Every generation someone returns to that place, an explorer, a historian, a curious traveler, and every generation one of them claims to hear something, always at the same time, always when the temperature falls below -40. The Dominion called it an unfortunate mystery. The Cree called it a curse, and to those who still patrol that desolate edge between forest and tundra, it is simply known as the frozen line, a border not marked on any map where sound travels too far and the past refuses to stay buried. William Hartley was not the kind of man to believe in myths. 32 years old, son of a railway inspector from Kingston, a veteran of the Yukon detachment, he was disciplined, rational, and devoted to the Dominion's new northern frontier. His letters home, preserved by his sister, show no hint of superstition. "The cold is unrelenting," he wrote in early January, "but the men hold steady." Dwyer's sense of direction is remarkable. The Cree guides work quietly, almost too quietly. He described the northern wilderness as a white silence without horizon, a place where sound died before it reached the ear. Dwyer, by contrast, was a believer. He had served under the mounted police during the Klondike years and had seen what the cold could do to the mind. To him, the forest wasn't empty, it was listening. "There are old things out here," he told a corporal from the Fort Albany post before they left. "Things that walk when men shouldn't." The guides Mathieu John Redsky and a half-French scout named Leclerc avoided meeting his eyes. To them, this was not bravado, but warning. The land north of the Albany River was not simply cold, it was alive, ancient, hungry. 2 days into the patrol, Hartley began recording weather conditions by the hour. Temperatures dropped below -45. The dogs grew restless, refusing to advance beyond a frozen ridge lined with spruce, bent under ice. Dwyer's notes, later found in a waterlogged satchel, spoke of drumming noises beyond the tree line and a smell like burned meat carried by the wind. Hartley dismissed it as aurora interference sound waves distorted by shifting temperature layers. Yet on the 4th night, when they camped near the banks of the Kenegami River, every man reported hearing the same thing, a low hum rising from beneath the snow. Redsky, the Cree guide, warned them not to answer. "If it calls your name, you turn away," he said. "That's not wind, that's hunger speaking." Dwyer laughed, but Hartley noted that his voice trembled. The men kept their rifles close. In the dark, something moved between the tents, too heavy for fox, too slow for bear. The dogs whimpered and tore their lines. The fire guttered and hissed as if smothered by breath. When dawn came, they found wide prints crossing the frozen river, each step deep, deliberate ending where the ice cracked. Hartley wrote, "We are being followed. Possibly a large moose or elk. Dwyer insists otherwise." Later that day, one of the dogs was found dead beside the sled. Throat unbroken, body frozen in an arc as though pulled backward. The Cree guides refused to continue. Leclerc muttered prayers in French. Dwyer cleaned his rifle twice in 1 hour. That night, Hartley recorded the patrol's first phonograph entry, now warped beyond recognition. Listeners describe faint tapping, then a voice almost pleading, "Do not go north." By the 7th day, exhaustion overtook them. Supplies dwindled faster than expected. The aurora flickered constantly, a green flame over the ridges. The cold no longer stung, it numbed, blurred the edges of thought. Dwyer began to speak of lights moving parallel to their trail. Hartley, meticulous as ever, wrote coordinates beside each claim. The last page in his book lists 6 lights evenly spaced, closing in from both sides. His handwriting deteriorates halfway through the line. What little remained of the men's sanity fractured during the blizzard that followed. The Cree guides, unable to bear the sound outside the tents, fled south. Only their sled tracks were ever found. The remaining 3 policemen huddled inside, burning the last of their maps for heat. In one recovered scrap of parchment likely torn from that fire, someone scrawled the words, "It knows our names." Forensic analysis confirmed Hartley's hand. The pattern of events mirrored older accounts buried in Jesuit archives from the 17th century, records of northern missions, describing a devouring spirit that appeared when hunger outweighed prayer. Those priests, too, wrote of voices echoing through frozen lakes of men, driven mad by whispers that promised warmth. They called it Wendigo, the eater of all things. Hartley had no such reference, but his tone shifted in the final notes. He no longer wrote of frostbite or fatigue. He wrote of presence. Dwyer says it waits by the ridge. I hear it walking. When I count 6 steps, it stops. When I stop writing, it comes closer. The Dominion inquiry decades later questioned whether carbon monoxide poisoning might explain the delirium. Yet the absence of soot inside the tents refuted that. No fumes, no rot, just a perfect sterile cold. And then there's the last testimony, the one few archivists mention. Sergeant Hale's adjutant, who photographed the site in March, claimed the negatives developed wrong. Light exposure, the report reads. But in the margins of his private journal, the adjutant described the figures he saw emerging on the plates. Silhouettes of men standing shoulder to shoulder, behind the frozen tent, motionless, expressionless, half-transparent. Their faces were Hartley's men, he wrote, and one more beside them, taller, black-eyed, smiling. The church at Moose Factory later conducted rites over the area. They said the snow refused to melt even after the blessing. Hunters claimed their traps iced overnight within that same perimeter. The government restricted further patrols north of the Kinagami line for the next decade, citing instability of terrain. No further expeditions were recorded until 1923. By then, the original route had vanished beneath a new forest, one that by all accounts grows faster and denser than any surrounding region. Botanists call it anomaly. The locals call it warning. In the end, what remains of Hartley's patrol is neither legend nor proof it is the space between. 6 men lost 6 names echoing across a century of ice. The files end with an empty line, a page left blank where the report should conclude. Perhaps the clerk stopped writing. Perhaps he too heard the wind shift outside the window. Because every year when January returns, the same chill descends across the northern forests, and radio operators near Moose Factory report faint rhythmic signals pulsing through static 6 beats, then silence. 6 names, then the sound of breathing. By the time the search parties reached the Kinagami corridor, winter had already swallowed the trail. The Dominion dispatched 2 detachments, 12 men each armed with telegraph beacons and sled provisions meant for 3 weeks. They advanced in relays, moving cautiously through valleys buried in snow deeper than any of them had ever seen. The landscape felt wrong, too symmetrical, too silent. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Sergeant Hale's log described the sensation as standing inside a bell after it's been struck. The echoes of their own steps lingered in the air far longer than they should have. On the fifth day, they located the first trace of Hartley's patrol, a broken snowshoe, half buried beneath the drift, its straps still supple despite the cold. Nearby lay a scrap of wool cloth torn from a parka sleeve. Hale noted that the tear pattern suggested force from within, not without, as though the arm had been yanked backward violently. Two of his men insisted the fabric smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire had burned in weeks. That night, one of the sled dogs began to howl uncontrollably. The sound triggered the others until the noise rose into a frenzy that echoed through the valley like a funeral wail. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chorus stopped. The silence that followed felt alive. The men reported hearing something just beyond the tense, slow, deliberate breathing, followed by 3 heavy thuds in the snow. When they emerged at dawn, the perimeter was untouched, but the dog was gone. Only its collar remained frozen upright in the ice as if the animal had evaporated mid-yank. The men pressed north. Snow drifted thick as smoke, blinding them. Compasses faltered. The needles shuddered, then froze, pointing due west. Hale, relying on the last known coordinates from Hartley's log, led them toward the ridge. That was when they found the first circle. It was etched into the ice 10 feet across its edges, smooth as glass. In the center, the snow had melted into a shallow depression. Hale dropped a match into it. The flame extinguished instantly, not from wind, but from something denser, colder. The temperature inside the circle measured 15 degrees lower than the air around it. Half his men wanted to turn back. The others argued they were close. The following day, they discovered the camp. Everything Hartley had described was there, the tents, upright rations, untouched journals frozen mid-line. And inside one tent on a crate of maps lay a phonograph cylinder labeled simply for record. Hale sealed it in wax and ordered it sent back to Fort Albany. He never heard what it contained. The cylinder cracked during transport. When archivists later attempted to play it, they caught only fragments, whined a rhythmic tapping, then 6 faint voices reciting something that sounded like numbers or names. Among the artifacts recovered was a compass fused solid. It bore no sign of rust, no moisture damage, just a seamless metallic sheen, as if it had melted and refrozen into one perfect circle. The Dominion sent it to Ottawa for analysis. The report returned inconclusive. Unknown metallurgical alteration, it read. Possible exposure to high magnetic field. No natural source of such energy existed in the region. By the second week, Hale's men began to break down. Private Kerr claimed to see movement across the snow, tall shapes passing between the trees, never closer than the edge of vision. The others accused him of nerves until they heard the same heavy footfalls during the next night watch. Hale recorded no visual confirmation, but the snow vibrated under our feet. The sound carried through the ice like thunder beneath water. He doubled the sentries. By morning, one guard was missing. His footprints led 20 yards beyond the camp and ended abruptly at the frozen lake. No sign of struggle, no broken ice. Just a single glove resting on the surface, palm up as though waiting to be taken. 2 men refused to proceed. Hale ordered them back with the supply sleds. They departed at dawn and were never seen again. When the main party retraced their path 3 days later, they found the sled, overturned dogs dead, and both men lying side by side in the snow. Faces, blue eyes open, no sign of frostbite or trauma. Their bodies were rigid, untouched by scavengers. Hale buried them under cairns of rock and continued north. The survivors reached Fort Albany nearly a month later. They spoke little. Reports filtered in piecemeal, rewritten multiple times under the supervision of Ottawa officers. Some described the journey as an exercise in endurance. Others called it the most silent march in memory. None mentioned what they saw between the trees that last night. But one letter written by Corporal Quinn to his wife survived the censor's fire. When the wind stopped, he wrote, "I heard someone whisper my name. It wasn't any of the men. It was higher, like a voice made of ice scraping across glass." Within weeks, all 12 men were reassigned. Hale left the force the following year. His obituary decades later notes, he died after a prolonged illness of the nerves. The symptoms resembled what doctors now call auditory hallucination. In his private papers sealed until 1968, he described one final event, the official record omitted. On the night before retreating from the site, he claimed to have found new prints beside his tent. They were human barefoot, each one pressed perfectly into the snow without melting it. He followed them for 30 paces, flashlight shaking in his hand, until they disappeared into the air itself, as if the walker had stepped upward and vanished. The inquiry that followed in Ottawa treated the case as a navigational tragedy. The newspapers printed small paragraphs under headlines like, "Patrol lost in northern blizzard. No survivors found." It was efficient, clean, acceptable. But inside the Dominion archives, the file thickened with appended notes, meteorological anomalies, testimonies of aural distortion, sightings of lights across the lakes. In 1914, a linguist attached to the Royal Society studied the phonograph fragments and claimed the faint voices repeated the same Cree word again and again, Pimatisuin, meaning life. Yet the syllables were inverted, spoken backward, as if the record itself had reversed time. For years after, trappers along the Albany corridor reported phantom camps, faint orange glows between trees, distant barking of unseen dogs. Those who approached found nothing but snow pressed flat in the shape of tents, as though made by shadows. One missionary described seeing men walking in a line across the lake at dusk, silent heads bowed. When he called out, they dissolved into mist. The Cree avoided that area entirely. They said the Wendigo had taken the patrol because it was not hunger that drew them north, but pride, the human desire to map a place that was never meant to be mapped. They spoke of a spirit bound to the frozen ground, a shape made of wind and memory, feeding on those who listened too long to the silence. "It's not the beast that kills," one elder said, "it's the echo." By the mid-1920s, the case faded into folklore. The Dominion erased the coordinates from official charts, claiming the river had shifted course. Yet pilots flying north to supply the trading posts continued to report magnetic interference exactly where the patrol vanished. Compasses spun. Radios crackled with voices repeating in faint rhythmic intervals, 6 syllables, always the same pattern. Engineers attributed it to solar storms, though none were recorded at the time. The frozen line remains unmarked on maps even now. Hunters still find circles of unmelted frost under midsummer moss. Campers wake to the sound of breathing just beyond their tents. Some leave food outside, as the Cree once did, bits of fat and tobacco, offered to the hunger in the snow. And sometimes, when the night is clear enough and the aurora folds low across the horizon, a single figure appears at the edge of the forest, tall, motionless, blurred by the shimmer of light. Those who've seen it say it doesn't move until you stop looking. Then it's closer. Hartley's patrol never returned. But every generation, the same coordinates draw someone new. They come with modern gear, satellite beacons, digital cameras. And still something pulls the signal from their hands, freezes the batteries, twists the compass needle back toward the ridge. The pattern never changes. 6 men go north. 6 voices whisper back. And when the snow begins to fall, the silence answers once again. Decades passed before anyone dared to reopen the file. The war years came and went. The world burned elsewhere, and the wilderness reclaimed its silence. But in 1946, a young anthropologist named Harold Cormier from McGill University returned to the North with a crate of recording equipment and a curiosity that bordered on obsession. He had read the fragments of the Dominion reports, hand-copied by a clerk, who called them the only true ghost story in Canadian history. His goal was not to solve the mystery, but to listen to it. He believed something in that frozen corridor carried an acoustic memory, sound trapped in ice like insects in amber. Cormier and his Cree interpreter, Joseph Bear, established a base near the mouth of the Kenegami River, not far from the coordinates of the vanished patrol. For 2 weeks, they heard nothing but wind. Then, on the 3rd night, the air temperature plummeted. The river froze solid in a single hour. Cormier recorded faint pulses beneath the surface, low frequencies, rhythmic, too regular to be natural. He described it as a slow heartbeat beneath glass. Bear refused to remain. He said the land was remembering the men who should have stayed buried. Cormier continued alone. His final field notes describe footprints, 6 distinct impressions, in a line frozen mid-stride, each one filled with crystalline frost that never melted even when he lit a fire beside them. In his last entry, written the night before he disappeared, he scrawled, "The ice is talking. It says our names backward." His body was never found. His recording equipment surfaced months later, half buried downstream. On the tape there is wind, and after a minute a man's voice whispering numbers from 1 to 6. Then silence. The pattern had returned. 6 steps. 6 men. 6 echoes. Historians dismissed the phenomenon as folklore repeating itself, a self-fulfilling myth. Yet the evidence accumulated. Pilots navigating the Hudson Corridor reported compass errors within the same radius. Geologists measuring magnetic flux found localized spikes in the exact spot marked Frozen Line 1912. Scientists speculated that permafrost movements created infrasound capable of inducing hallucinations, fear, disorientation, panic. But when they played those infrasound frequencies in controlled chambers, no one heard voices. Only dread. In 1958, a Royal Canadian Air Force reconnaissance team attempted aerial mapping of the region. Their photographs came back distorted streaks of light bending in unnatural arcs, as if the camera lens had captured something moving faster than the shutter could see. One image catalogued as Frame 22A showed a faint outline of 6 figures standing beside what appeared to be tents. Analysts assumed it was double exposure. Yet the pilot interviewed before his death insisted he saw no structures below, only a stretch of ice smooth as steel. He described feeling pressure in his chest, like descending too deep underwater. Across the decades, the name Wendigo resurfaced again and again, straddling the line between anthropology and theology. Among the Cree and Ojibwe, it was never a creature of simple hunger. It was a warning against imbalance. When men took too much from the land, when greed outweighed gratitude, the Wendigo appeared not to kill, but to consume the memory of what had been human. It was famine given shape, guilt turned into voice. Priests called it superstition, but the pattern fit too well. The patrol had been sent not to survive, but to extract, to map routes, claim resources, carve lines through a wilderness that owed them nothing. And the land perhaps had answered. In the 1970s, a team of mineral surveyors rediscovered the coordinates buried in Ottawa's archives. They arrived with helicopters, heat sensors, and skepticism. On the first night, their instruments malfunctioned. Temperature gauges fluctuated wildly. One camera filmed frost forming on its own lens in midair. The crew leader, an engineer named Patton, recorded in his log, "I thought I saw movement by the ridge. 6 shadows walking parallel to the line. They left no trace." I called out. The echo came back 6 times. The footage ended abruptly. The crew abandoned the mission, leaving thousands of dollars in equipment behind. When recovery teams arrived days later, they found the gear perfectly preserved, but half encased in ice, though temperatures never dropped below freezing. Decades of folklore began merging with science, each unable to disprove the other. Some said magnetic anomalies caused all of it. Others whispered of old spirits reclaiming their domain. But somewhere between geology and superstition lay something that neither could name, the bridge between matter and myth. That's what the Cree elders meant when they spoke of the thin place where the human and the eternal overlap. The frozen line, they said, was one of them. In 1991, a field researcher named Elizabeth Dower uncovered the lost phonograph cylinder from the Dominion archives, the one marked for record. She played it under modern restoration equipment, filtering noise through digital analysis. What emerged was not language but rhythm. 6 tones spaced precisely 7 seconds apart. When converted into waveform, the frequencies matched human speech patterns, whispers drawn out into breath. And hidden beneath the main track, nearly inaudible, was another sound. Dower slowed it down 8 times. It formed a word, Hartley. Then the pattern repeated. 6 tones, 6 breaths, 6 names. Her findings never reached publication. Weeks later, she was found unconscious in her lab, suffering from severe hypothermia despite working indoors. The phonograph cylinder was missing. She survived, but refused to speak of it again. In her notebook, she left one line. "They are not gone, they are still answering." By then, the Wendigo legend had drifted from folklore into psychology, an explanation for isolation, madness, hunger. But deep in Ontario's archives, the classified files tell a quieter story of men erased from maps of instruments that refuse to record, of a sound that travels through ice like memory through bone. Some historians suggest that what the Dominion called fate unknown was in truth something older, an echo that feeds on repetition. Each investigation, each retelling gives it form again. Each voice becomes part of its breath. And so the pattern continues, every generation, drawn north by curiosity, each finding less than before. The campsites shrink, the tracks grow fainter, until only the whisper remains. They say if you play any recording made within that valley, you'll hear it faintly under the static 6 pulses a delay, and then your own name spoken back slower than you said it. Scientists call it feedback. The Cree call it remembering. Somewhere in the ice time still circles that night in 1912, looping endlessly 6 men forever standing on the frozen line between hunger and memory. Between the living and the echo that won't release them. The blizzard began without warning. No wind, no shift in cloud, only a sudden dimming of light, as though the sun had been dragged behind a curtain. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in a heartbeat. The forest fell silent. And in that silence, something began to move. The sound was faint at first, like the cracking of ice underfoot, but it carried rhythm, almost deliberate. 6 beats. Then stillness. 6 more. Sergeant Hale once wrote that the snow there never simply fell. It listened on its way down. That was how it felt now, the world holding its breath, as something unseen pressed against the fabric of air. In the decades after, those who ventured close to the ridge spoke of a pressure, an invisible weight that thickened the air until speech became impossible. Words froze in the throat, half born, half dreamed. The Cree said it was the moment when the Wendigo crossed between worlds, the instant when cold itself turned alive. You did not see it. You heard it first, the drawn-out breath of the forest inhaling your name. The government expedition of 2002, the last official attempt to map the region, carried with them satellite transmitters, motion sensors, and an onboard thermal drone. The recording survived. The men did not. On the third night at 02:37 a.m., every sensor registered a sudden drop in temperature, localized to a 50-meter radius, exactly matching the coordinates of the 1912 camp. The video feed showed the drone circling above the ice, its lens fogging over in slow, concentric pulses. Then out of the fog, faint light appeared, vertical, rippling, almost human in shape. The drone's telemetry glitched. Altitude data froze. The final image transmitted was a white field interrupted by 6 elongated shadows stretching in opposite directions, as though cast by 2 suns. The recovery team found the camp weeks later. The tents stood intact. The food sealed. All 6 transmitters lay arranged in a perfect circle. Inside the command tent, written in frost across the inner wall, were 6 names, the same from the Dominion roster, traced by something that did not melt. The handwriting was Hartley's. That was when the realization began to take hold, that whatever haunted the frozen line was not memory, but continuation. Time there did not pass. It folded. Each generation that entered the corridor was caught inside the same loop, the same storm, the same hour, the same breath on the air. The Wendigo, if that was its name, did not devour bodies. It devoured chronology. It trapped the moment of hunger, the second before death, forever repeating, forever feeding. Researchers who analyzed the drone's final audio noticed another pattern. Beneath the wind, beneath the distortion, there was a voice counting backward from 6 to 1, and when it reached 1, the signal died. The count matched the pulse intervals found on Dower's phonograph decades earlier. Same timing, same cadence, the same voice. The men who heard it firsthand never lasted long. One technician assigned to restore the corrupted files resigned after claiming he heard his own breathing on the playback, perfectly synchronized, though he had been alone in the lab. Another described dreaming of white figures standing at the edge of his bed, silent, waiting. The official report cited psychological fatigue caused by prolonged exposure to subharmonic distortion. Off record, the archivists called it infection, not of the body, but of the timeline. The ice carried echoes, they said, and once you listened, you became part of it. Local hunters avoid the ridge entirely now. They say the wind there carries voices, old voices repeating fragments of orders, coordinates, and prayers. They still patrol, one trapper told a journalist in 2011. You can hear their boots in the snow when the moon is gone. But there's no one there. Just the sound walking in a circle over and over like they never found their way out. He refused to give his name. The following spring, his cabin was found empty, door ajar, radio still playing static. Scientists who revisit the phenomenon argue over cause and meaning. Some insist it's permafrost resonance, natural infrasound that warps perception. Others quietly believe the story as told by the elders, that the Wendigo is not a beast, but a hunger born from history itself, a record that never decays. The 1912 patrol fed it first, and every curious mind since has fed it again by remembering. That is how it stays alive through the telling, the retelling, the echo. The climax of the legend came during the winter of 2019, when a remote team from the Canadian Geological Survey recorded a quake beneath the frozen line. It lasted exactly 6 seconds. The epicenter aligned perfectly with the last coordinates of Hartley's camp. Seismographs captured a sub-frequency that translated when amplified into 6 sharp impacts, followed by what one analyst described as a drawn breath like a sigh. Immediately after, the temperature across the region dropped by 12 degrees. The aurora flared red. Locals reported a glow over the ridge that pulsed 6 times before vanishing. No bodies were found, no instruments recovered. But satellite images from that night show a perfect circle etched into the ice 50 meters across, untouched by wind or snow, glowing faintly in infrared. The file was classified within hours. Yet even classified files leave traces, and those who've seen it say the circle remains visible on thermal scans, each January 25th, the night of the original disappearance. There is no explanation left that satisfies both reason and silence. What happened in 1912 has never stopped happening. It exists outside of history, replaying itself through snow and memory. Every report, every photograph, every whisper is another layer added to the loop, another frost on the glass. The Wendigo was never one thing. It was the act of vanishing itself, the hunger to know that consumes the knowing. And if you stand there long enough on that white expanse where no shadow falls straight, the wind begins to thicken. It hums low, almost human, almost kind. It calls 6 names, then yours. It asks you to take one more step forward, to look, to listen, to become another sound beneath the ice. At that moment, the legend closes its circle. The patrol completed the record, unbroken, the frozen line still alive, waiting for the next breath to answer. They say the snow never truly melts there, it only sleeps. Each spring, the rivers thaw, the forest breathes again, and yet the ridge remains frozen, untouched, a wound that refuses to heal. Satellite images still show faint geometric scars where tents once stood. The scientists call them anomalies. The Cree call them memories. And the few who've stood there in person tell the same story. The air tastes metallic like the moment before lightning strikes, and the silence presses against your chest until you feel your own heartbeat slowing to match something older, deeper, buried beneath the ice. No official expedition has entered since 2019. The corridor is closed, the records sealed. But each winter, hikers vanish along the outer routes, one pair in 2020, a photographer in 2022, and a group of snowmobilers just last year. Their GPS units show the same thing, 6 stops, then a signal loss exactly at 2:37 a.m. The hour never changes. When the devices are recovered, their internal clocks are frozen on that same time, as if the cold itself has chosen the moment it prefers. Locals still whisper about the Wendigo, but the word has shifted meaning. It no longer describes a creature, it describes a place, a boundary between what happened and what keeps happening. A loop that feeds on curiosity on every investigator who swore they would only look once. The legend endures not because anyone survived, but because we can't stop telling it. That is its sustenance, the retelling, the replay, the human urge to open the file one more time, to press play, even when the sound beneath the static begins to breathe. Some nights when the temperature drops and the aurora folds low over Hudson Bay, shortwave radio operators pick up a repeating pulse. 6 tones, then silence. 6 again, then a faint voice between frequencies reciting words no one can quite decipher. One operator swears he heard it speak a date, January 25th. Another says it said his name. He turned off his receiver and hasn't transmitted since. And so the story circles back Hartley Dwyer, the 6 steps on the ice, the 6 echoes that never fade. Maybe they are still out there, walking beneath the frozen crust of time, following the sound of their own names across eternity. Or maybe it's us, every listener who leans closer, straining to hear what the wind is really saying. Because the Wendigo is not hunger, not madness, it is attention. The moment you listen, you belong to it. And now the storm is quiet again. The ice holds its breath. The coordinates remain carved into official silence, waiting for another generation to disbelieve and return. Until then, the patrol marches on unseen, 6 shadows pacing endlessly beneath the snow, still counting, still calling, still answering the cold. You've just heard another case from Echoes of the Unknown. If you want to know what waits beyond the last recorded word, subscribe, listen again, and remember, some voices aren't meant to fade.